Thomas Harrington froze, medical kit suspended in midair as the dying wolf's amber eyes locked with his own. The creature wasn't fighting or fleeing. It was waiting. Sheriff Reed dropped his radio with a clatter, backpedaling until his spine pressed against a pine trunk. "Jesus Christ, Tom, that's no regular wolf," he hissed, hand instinctively reaching for his holster. Blood matted the magnificent animal's silver-gray coat, each labored breath revealing exposed ribs beneath its torn flesh. Yet in those eyes, those impossibly knowing eyes, Thomas recognized something he'd seen in his own bathroom mirror each morning, the vacant stare of someone who had lost everything and was simply waiting for the end. "Don't move," Thomas whispered, though whether to the sheriff or the wolf he wasn't certain. What force had brought him here, to this moment, to this creature? And why did he feel, with bone-deep certainty, that everything depended on what he did next? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Thomas Harrington's cabin sat on 40 acres of rugged Arizona wilderness, miles from the nearest neighbor, exactly how he wanted it. The early morning light streamed through dusty windows, illuminating a space that spoke of a life interrupted rather than one being lived. Veterinary journals from a decade ago still sat in neat stacks. A framed photograph lay face down on the mantel, untouched for years. At 65, Thomas moved with the deliberate care of a man whose body had betrayed him. Arthritis plagued his once steady surgeon's hands, and the occasional tightness in his chest served as a reminder of the heart attack 2 years prior. He poured his coffee, black, no sugar, and stepped onto the porch that overlooked the canyon beyond. "Another day above ground," he muttered to himself, the same words he'd spoken each morning since moving here. It wasn't gratitude so much as acknowledgement. 15 years earlier, Thomas Harrington had been the most respected wildlife veterinarian in the Southwest. His research on endangered species had earned him acclaim. His clinic had treated everything from bald eagles to mountain lions, and his testimony had helped shape conservation policy. Then came the Lowell case. A wealthy donor's prized endangered Mexican wolf had died under Thomas's care. The subsequent investigation claimed negligence, though Thomas maintained the animal had been poisoned before arriving at his clinic. The legal battle bankrupted him, his reputation destroyed. His wife, Caroline, stayed through the trial but left shortly after, unable to weather the storm of his growing bitterness. "I fell in love with a healer," she'd said, suitcase in hand. "Not whatever you're becoming." That was 10 years ago. Now Thomas lived on Social Security and the occasional consultation when a local couldn't afford a proper vet for their livestock. He spoke more to the birds he fed than to people, and that suited him just fine. The headlines had been brutal. "Renowned vet kills endangered species." "Conservation hero falls from grace." And the most damning, "Harrington negligence may have doomed subspecies." That last one had nearly broken him, the implication that his actions might have pushed a bloodline toward extinction. Thomas finished his coffee, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. His routine never varied. Coffee at sunrise, check property fences, gather firewood, attempt to read with failing eyesight, bourbon at sunset, fitful sleep plagued by memories of animals he couldn't save. This particular morning, however, would be different. Had he known how different, he might have savored that coffee longer, might have looked more carefully at the beauty of the canyon spread before him. Because by nightfall, everything Thomas Harrington believed about his life, his purpose, his future, his capacity for redemption, would be irreversibly changed by a chance encounter with a creature as wounded and lost as himself. The morning had started like any other until Thomas spotted unusual tracks while checking his property's eastern fence line. Something had dragged itself across the dusty ground, leaving an irregular trail that disappeared into a dense thicket of mesquite. Blood droplets stained the parched earth. Thomas hesitated. His days of tracking injured wildlife were long behind him. Whatever was wounded would likely die. Nature's way. He had no license to practice, no obligation to intervene. Yet something pulled him forward, muscle memory from a life he'd left behind. The mesquite branches scratched his forearms as he pushed through. The air hung thick with the metallic scent of blood and the musk of wild animal. When the brush finally opened to a small clearing, Thomas stopped cold. A large male gray wolf lay sprawled on its side, 3 distinct bullet wounds visible through matted fur. Its flanks rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. Thomas estimated the animal weighed around 120 pounds when healthy, though it now appeared significantly underweight. Its coat, a striking silver-gray pattern with distinctive facial markings, suggested it wasn't native to these parts. Common sense told Thomas to back away. Wounded predators were unpredictable at best, deadly at worst. But the wolf's eyes, amber with flecks of gold, fixed on him with an unsettling awareness. No fear, no aggression, just assessment. "You're a long way from home," Thomas murmured, crouching at a safe distance. "Someone did a number on you." The wolf made no attempt to rise. 2 of the wounds appeared to be through and through bullet holes in the hindquarters. The third, more concerning, was a graze along the ribcage that had torn a 6-inch gash. Based on the blood coagulation, Thomas estimated the injuries were at least 24 hours old. Against every sensible instinct, Thomas opened the small first aid kit he still carried out of habit. The wolf's eyes tracked his movements, but it remained eerily still. "I should call Fish and Wildlife," Thomas said, more to himself than the animal. "They'd euthanize you, or maybe rehabilitate you if you're lucky." Thomas knew the statistics. Adult wolves rarely integrated into captivity successfully after living wild. Euthanasia was the likely outcome. "Damned if I do, damned if I don't," he muttered. The wolf blinked slowly, a gesture that struck Thomas as oddly deliberate. Thomas made a decision that would later seem either the height of foolishness or the most important choice of his life. He removed his flannel shirt, leaving him in a worn undershirt, and approached slowly, speaking in low, even tones. "I'm either about to help you or get my throat ripped out. Your call." The wolf remained still as Thomas draped the shirt over its massive head, creating a makeshift blindfold. This old veterinary trick sometimes calmed injured animals. To his surprise, the wolf submitted to the treatment without resistance. With practiced efficiency, Thomas examined the wounds more closely. The bullets had missed major arteries and organs. Lucky. The wolf was severely dehydrated and likely hadn't eaten for days. "You should be dead," Thomas told it frankly. "Someone up there must like you." The trek back to his cabin was arduous. Thomas fashioned a travois from branches and his belt, creating a crude drag sled. The wolf, partially sedated with the emergency painkillers from Thomas's kit, lay still during the journey, occasionally raising its head as if to check their progress. By the time they reached the cabin, Thomas's heart was racing dangerously, sweat soaking his undershirt despite the mild spring temperature. He hadn't exerted himself like this in years, and his chest tightened in warning. "Almost there, big guy," he wheezed, pulling the travois up the porch steps. Inside, Thomas cleared his kitchen table and covered it with plastic sheeting. With considerable effort, he lifted the wolf onto the makeshift operating surface. The animal weighed less than it should. Thomas guessed it had been starving even before being shot. Thomas worked methodically, falling into the practiced rhythm of his former profession. He cleaned the wounds, extracted bullet fragments, stitched torn flesh, and administered antibiotics from his dwindling emergency supply. Throughout the procedure, the wolf remained unnervingly cooperative, as if understanding the necessity of each painful step. "You've been around humans before," Thomas observed. "You're too calm otherwise." When the worst was addressed, Thomas moved the wolf to a cleared area near the wood stove, creating a bed from old blankets. He offered water, which the animal lapped weakly before collapsing into unconsciousness. Thomas sat heavily in his armchair, suddenly aware of his racing pulse and the tremor in his hands. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving exhaustion in its wake. What had he done? Harboring an injured wolf was almost certainly illegal. If the animal died, he could face charges of interfering with wildlife. If it lived and attacked someone, the liability would be enormous. "Stupid old man," he chided himself. "Haven't learned a damn thing." Yet watching the wolf's chest rise and fall steadily, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. He'd taken action instead of turning away. For better or worse, he was back in the game of saving lives. Morning brought the sound of tires on gravel. Thomas, who had dozed in his chair watching the wolf through the night, started awake. Sheriff Marcus Reed's patrol vehicle was pulling up outside. The wolf, remarkably, was awake and alert, golden eyes fixed on the door. It made no sound, but tensed visibly. "Stay," Thomas commanded, unsure if the word meant anything to the wild animal. To his surprise, the wolf remained in place, though its eyes never left the door. Thomas stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. Sheriff Reed, a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and the perpetually sunburned complexion of outdoor law enforcement, approached with the casual familiarity of long acquaintance. "Morning, Tom. Got a report of gunshots out this way yesterday. Thought I'd check in." Thomas kept his expression neutral. "Didn't hear anything. Could have been hunters on public land over the ridge." Reed nodded, seemingly satisfied, then frowned as he noticed the blood on Thomas's undershirt. "You hurt yourself?" "Skinned a rabbit," Thomas lied. "Getting sloppy in my old age." Reed didn't look entirely convinced. "Listen, while I'm here, folks are talking about increased wolf activity in the region. Fish and Wildlife's got Curtis Blackwell all over it." "You remember Curtis?" Thomas stiffened slightly. "I remember him." Curtis Blackwell had been a junior researcher during Thomas's downfall. One of the few who had publicly supported the negligence allegations. Now, apparently, he'd risen to a position of authority. "He's heading up predator management for the district now," Reed continued, oblivious to Thomas's discomfort. "Says we've got wolves moving into areas they shouldn't be. Wants everyone to report sightings." "I'll keep an eye out," Thomas replied noncommittally. Reed nodded, then hesitated. "You doing okay out here, Tom? Been a while since you came into town." "I'm fine, Marcus. Just enjoying the quiet." The sheriff seemed about to say more when a sound came from inside the cabin, the scrape of claws on wooden flooring. Reed's hand instinctively moved toward his holster. "Got company?" Thomas positioned himself more firmly in front of the door. "Just a stray dog I'm looking after." "Nothing to worry about." Reed studied Thomas's face. They'd known each other for 20 years, long enough for the sheriff to recognize evasion. "Tom, you know I respect your privacy, but if there's something I should know—" "There isn't," Thomas interrupted. "Dog got tangled in some barbed wire. I'm patching him up, that's all." After a long moment, Reed nodded. "All right. But Tom, the department's keeping close tabs on predator activity these days. Blackwell's got the county commissioners convinced we're facing some kind of wolf crisis. Don't do anything that might complicate things." The warning was clear. Reed might look the other way for minor infractions, but harboring a protected predator wasn't something he could ignore. After the sheriff departed, Thomas returned inside to find the wolf had dragged itself back to the blankets by the stove, leaving a small trail of blood from reopened wounds. "That was close," Thomas told the animal, kneeling to check the damage. "You're going to get us both in trouble." The wolf gazed at him steadily, then did something unexpected. It lowered its massive head to rest on Thomas's knee. a gesture of either submission or trust that took his breath away. "You need a name," Thomas said after a moment. "Can't keep calling you Wolf if you're staying a while." The timber-like coloration of the wolf's coat caught the morning light, the silver-gray fur rippling like woodland shadows. "Timber," Thomas decided. "That work for you?" The wolf blinked slowly, that same deliberate gesture from before. Thomas chose to interpret it as agreement. "Timber it is, then. Now let's fix what you tore open before you bleed all over my floor." 2 weeks passed with surprising swiftness. Thomas established a routine around Timber's care, finding himself rising earlier each day with renewed purpose. The wolf's recovery progressed faster than expected, a testament to either Thomas's forgotten skills or the animal's remarkable resilience. By the end of the second week, Timber could walk without the pronounced limp that had initially accompanied each halting step. His wounds had closed cleanly, and his coat regained some of its luster as proper nutrition restored his strength. Thomas supplemented the wolf's diet with raw meat and high-protein dog food, expecting each day to see signs that the animal was ready to return to the wild. Those signs never came. On the 16th night, Thomas woke gasping from a nightmare, the same one that had plagued him for years. In it, he always stood in the surgical theater at his old clinic, the endangered Mexican wolf dying under his hands while faceless observers shouted accusations. Tonight, however, something interrupted the familiar terror. A weight settled on the edge of his bed, followed by a warm pressure against his side. Thomas froze, momentarily disoriented until his eyes adjusted to the darkness. Timber had placed his massive head on Thomas's chest, amber eyes reflecting the faint moonlight filtering through the window. "How did you—" Thomas began, then noticed the bedroom door ajar. He'd started closing it at night, not out of fear, but to give the wolf privacy in the main room. Somehow, Timber had learned to operate the handle. More surprising than the door was the clear intent behind the wolf's actions. It was almost as if he had sensed Thomas's distress and deliberately interrupted the nightmare. Thomas tentatively placed a hand on the animal's head, expecting him to pull away. Instead, Timber leaned into the touch, a soft rumble, not quite a growl, something gentler, emanating from his chest. "You're not what I expected," Thomas admitted quietly. Morning brought another surprise. Thomas emerged from the bathroom to find Timber sitting patiently beside his pill bottles. The wolf's gaze shifted deliberately between Thomas and the heart medication he occasionally neglected to take. "Now that's just unsettling," Thomas muttered, but dutifully swallowed the pill. These moments of uncanny intelligence accumulated over the following days. Timber learned to bring Thomas specific tools when he was working around the property. He appeared to recognize the names of objects and would retrieve items like water bottle or hat with startling accuracy. Once, when Thomas cut his hand on a piece of metal, Timber disappeared into the cabin and returned dragging the first aid kit. "Either I've gone completely senile and am imagining this," Thomas told the wolf one evening, "or you're the smartest damn canid I've ever encountered." Timber simply tilted his head, those expressive eyes revealing nothing. News of Thomas's unusual companion inevitably spread through the small community. The rural nature of the area meant that privacy was highly valued, but unusual events rarely remained secret for long. Thomas first realized his situation had become public knowledge when delivery driver Jimmy Parker arrived with supplies and refused to exit his truck. "Just leave it by the porch," Jimmy called through a barely cracked window. "That wolf of yours around?" Thomas sighed. "He's inside, Jimmy, and he's not dangerous." "That's what they all say before their faces get eaten off," Jimmy replied. But he did cautiously place the supplies on the porch before beating a hasty retreat. Similar interactions followed. Some neighbors stopped visiting entirely. Others, driven by curiosity, found excuses to drop by, hoping to glimpse the crazy hermit's pet wolf. Thomas turned most away, uncomfortable with the attention and protective of Timber. Not everyone's interest was benign. 3 days after Jimmy's delivery, a silver government-issue SUV rolled up Thomas's driveway. The vehicle bore the insignia of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Thomas felt his stomach tighten as Curtis Blackwell stepped out, clipboard in hand. At 58, Curtis looked much as Thomas remembered him, trim, meticulously groomed, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to authority. His hair had grayed significantly, and lines of stress bracketed his mouth, but his eyes held the same cold intensity Thomas recalled from years ago. "Dr. Harrington," Curtis greeted him with forced cordiality. "It's been a while." "Not long enough," Thomas replied, remaining on his porch. Inside, he could sense Timber moving to a window, observing silently. Curtis offered a thin smile. "I'm conducting follow-ups on reported wolf sightings in the area. Several residents have mentioned you might be harboring a wolf on your property." "People talk too much." "Indeed they do." Curtis glanced past Thomas toward the cabin windows. "In this case, however, their concerns fall under my jurisdiction. Housing wildlife, particularly predators, without proper permits is a federal offense." Thomas crossed his arms. "I'm aware of the regulations. I don't have any wolves here." "Then you wouldn't mind if I took a look around?" Curtis held up his clipboard. "I have the necessary inspection authorization." Thomas felt a cold anger rising. This wasn't a coincidental inspection. Curtis had deliberately sought him out. The history between them ensured this wasn't merely professional duty. "My property is private. Unless you have a warrant, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Curtis's smile tightened. "I had hoped we could handle this amicably." "Professional courtesy and all that." "Professional courtesy?" Thomas couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. "Like the courtesy you showed during the Lowell hearings, when you testified that my negligence likely killed that animal?" "I testified to the facts as I understood them," Curtis replied evenly. "The committee made its own determination. The committee crucified me based on manipulated evidence, and you helped hand them the nails." The conversation had veered into dangerous territory. Thomas forced himself to take a steadying breath, conscious of his heart rate. Curtis studied him for a long moment. "The past is the past, Dr. Harrington. My concern now is ensuring public safety and wildlife regulations are being observed." He returned the clipboard to his vehicle. "I'll be back with proper documentation. In the meantime, I strongly suggest you reconsider your position." Harboring a wolf is a serious offense with significant penalties, particularly for someone with your history. The threat lingered in the air as Curtis drove away, dust billowing behind his vehicle. Inside, Thomas found Timber watching from the window, unnaturally still. "We've got trouble," he told the wolf, who seemed to understand perfectly well. That evening, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Eleanor Keller's ancient Subaru bumped up the driveway just as the sun was setting. Eleanor had been a colleague years ago, a wildlife biologist specializing in predator behavior. Their professional relationship had evolved into friendship, though they'd fallen out of regular contact after Thomas's retreat from society. "I heard rumors," she said without preamble when Thomas opened the door. "Thought I'd see for myself before the Blackwell storm hits." Thomas hesitated, then stepped aside to let her enter. "You've heard from Curtis?" "Everyone has. He's on some kind of crusade, claims we've got a dangerous wolf influx threatening the region, been pushing for expanded hunting permits even in protected areas." Eleanor stopped short when she spotted Timber, who observed her calmly from his place by the wood stove. "My God, he's magnificent." "His name's Timber," Thomas said, watching her reaction carefully. "Found him shot up on my property about a month ago." Eleanor approached slowly, her experienced gaze assessing the wolf. Timber remained still, allowing her to observe but maintaining a cautious distance. He's not wearing a collar or tag, she noted. Not from any reintroduction program I'm familiar with. She looked at Thomas. May I? At Thomas's nod, she knelt, extending her hand palm down at a non-threatening angle. Timber sniffed her fingers briefly, then retreated to Thomas's side. He's bonded to you, Eleanor observed. Unusual for an adult wild wolf. Very unusual, actually. He's an unusual wolf, Thomas replied, briefly recounting the instances of intelligence he'd witnessed. Eleanor listened intently, her scientific skepticism evident but not dismissive. Tool recognition and retrieval would be extraordinary even for highly trained domestic dogs, she said finally. May I see his wounds? Thomas coaxed Timber to lie down, revealing the healing bullet scars. Eleanor examined them with professional detachment. Hunting rifle, she concluded. Targeted shots, not defensive. Someone tried to kill him deliberately. She sat back on her heels. Thomas, I'm concerned. Curtis isn't just conducting routine checks. He's been almost obsessive about wolf management lately. There's something personal driving him. It felt personal when he showed up here, Thomas agreed. Eleanor hesitated. There's something you should know. 15 years ago, Curtis lost his daughter in what was officially reported as a wolf attack during a camping trip. The details were always murky. He was the only witness. But it changed him. He's been methodically working his way up the bureaucracy ever since, gaining more control over predator management policies. The information landed heavily. He never mentioned a daughter during the Lowell case. It had just happened. Maybe that's why he was so quick to blame you for negligence. He was looking for someone to punish when he couldn't punish the wolves that took his child. Eleanor shook her head. Regardless, he's leveraged his personal tragedy into considerable influence. If he knows you have Timber here, he won't stop until he's taken action. What are my options? Limited, Eleanor admitted. You could surrender Timber to a licensed wildlife rehabilitation center, but given his age and the fact that he's bonded with you. She left the implication hanging. Adult wolves rarely transition successfully to captivity. Or you need to prove he's special enough to warrant exception, research permit, educational ambassador status, something to make him more valuable alive and with you than removed or euthanized. Thomas looked at Timber, who gazed back with those intelligent eyes. And how do I do that? I can help, Eleanor said. I've still got connections in the research community. But Thomas, we need to move quickly. Curtis won't wait long. After Eleanor left, Thomas sat with Timber on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The wolf leaned against his leg, a warm presence in the cooling evening air. Seems we've both got enemies, Thomas told him quietly. Question is, what are we going to do about it? Timber's response was to rest his massive head on Thomas's knee, amber eyes reflecting starlight. The gesture felt like an answer, though Thomas couldn't quite decipher its meaning. That night, for the first time in years, Thomas slept without nightmares. Eleanor returned 3 days later with a digital camera, specimen collection kits, and formal documentation. If we're going to establish Timber as a research subject, we need to be methodical, she explained, setting up her equipment on Thomas's kitchen table. Physical measurements, DNA samples, behavioral observations, everything by the book. Thomas watched as she organized her materials with practiced efficiency. Will it be enough to keep Curtis at bay? Maybe. Eleanor didn't sugarcoat the situation. A research permit creates bureaucratic obstacles, which buys us time. Curtis has influence, but he still has to work within the system. Timber submitted to Eleanor's examination with surprising patience, allowing measurements and photographs without resistance. When she produced a cheek swab for DNA collection, the wolf actually opened his mouth on command, prompting a raised eyebrow from Eleanor. "I've worked with captive-born wolves who weren't this cooperative," she remarked, carefully securing the sample. "Told you he was special," Thomas replied. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor documented Timber's unusual behaviors. She set up simple intelligence tests, puzzle boxes containing food that required multiple steps to open, object recognition exercises, even basic counting assessments where treats were hidden under cups. Timber's performance consistently exceeded expectations for canids, wild or domestic. "It's remarkable," Eleanor admitted after reviewing her footage. "He's operating at the cognitive level of highly trained border collies or primates in some domains. The question is, why?" Thomas had been pondering the same question. Could he have been someone's research subject before? Maybe escaped from a facility? Possible, but unlikely. No research projects involving wolves have reported missing animals. And his behavior doesn't suggest prior captivity. He moves like a wild wolf who's chosen to cooperate, not like an animal conditioned through training. The mystery deepened when Thomas discovered something while brushing Timber's recovering coat. Along the wolf's left shoulder blade, nearly invisible beneath the fur, was a small patch of scar tissue in an unusual pattern. "Looks almost like a brand," Eleanor observed, photographing the mark. "Or maybe a healed burn, definitely man-made." "Could help us identify where he came from," Thomas suggested. "I'll send these images to colleagues who might recognize it." Eleanor hesitated. "Thomas, there's something else we should discuss. Timber's markings and physical characteristics. They're unusual. The coloration pattern, skull structure, even his size. They don't quite match typical gray wolf subspecies in this region. What are you suggesting?" "I'm not sure yet, but I'd like to run his DNA against some archival samples. It might help us understand why he's so unique." While Eleanor pursued the scientific angle, Thomas found himself drawn into investigating Curtis Blackwell's past. The mention of his daughter's death had awakened the investigative instincts Thomas had once applied to complex veterinary cases. Using the spotty internet connection at his cabin, Thomas searched news archives for information about the incident. The reports were surprisingly limited. A brief mention of a fatal wolf attack during a father-daughter camping trip in the Coconino National Forest 15 years earlier. 8-year-old Lily Blackwell had wandered from the campsite at dusk and was reportedly attacked by what authorities determined was a wolf pack. Her body was recovered the following day. The incident had prompted a controlled cull of wolves in the region. Something about the sparse reporting struck Thomas as odd. Wolf attacks on humans were exceedingly rare, so rare that they typically generated significant media coverage and detailed investigations. Yet this incident seemed almost deliberately understated. Thomas dug deeper, requesting old incident reports through contacts at the university where he'd once taught. What emerged was troubling. The official investigation had been cursory at best. Curtis, as the only witness, had provided the narrative that became the official account. The physical evidence was inconclusive. Lily's injuries could have been caused by wolves, but other scenarios hadn't been thoroughly explored. Most concerning was a detail buried in the medical examiner's preliminary notes. Lily's body showed signs of impact trauma inconsistent with typical predator attacks, injuries more commonly associated with falls. Thomas shared his findings with Eleanor during her next visit. She frowned as she reviewed the documents. "This doesn't add up," she agreed. The location where Lily was allegedly attacked was in disputed wolf territory. There were no confirmed pack sightings in that immediate area for months before the incident. Yet Curtis has built his entire career on preventing another tragedy like his daughter's, Thomas observed. If the wolf attack was questionable, then his crusade is based on something other than facts. Eleanor's expression grew troubled. "Thomas, if Curtis fabricated or exaggerated the wolf's role in his daughter's death, and we expose that, we'd be challenging the foundation of his identity and career, Thomas finished. No wonder he's so determined to control the wolf narrative. Their conversation was interrupted by a low growl from Timber, who had been dozing near the wood stove. The wolf was now fully alert, ears forward, staring at the door. Moments later, they heard vehicles approaching. Thomas moved to the window. 2 Fish and Wildlife SUVs and a Sheriff's Department cruiser were coming up the drive. Curtis Blackwell emerged from the lead vehicle, a document case in hand. "He's got his warrant," Thomas said grimly. Eleanor quickly gathered her research materials. "Remember, we have preliminary paperwork for a research permit. It's not finalized, but it establishes our intent and creates a legal gray area." Thomas nodded, his heart racing uncomfortably. "Stay behind me," he told both Eleanor and Timber as he went to meet the officials at his door. Curtis's expression was one of barely contained satisfaction as he presented the search warrant. "Dr. Harrington, we have authorization to inspect your property for illegally harbored wildlife." His gaze shifted to Eleanor. "Dr. Keller, I'm surprised to find you involved in this situation." "I'm conducting authorized research," Eleanor replied coolly, producing her preliminary documentation. "As you can see, we've initiated the proper channels for a behavioral study." Curtis barely glanced at the papers. "Preliminary applications don't supersede wildlife regulations or this warrant." He gestured to the officers behind him. "We'll proceed with the inspection." Sheriff Reed, looking uncomfortable with the situation, stepped forward. "Tom, it would be easier if you cooperated. No need to make this difficult." Thomas knew he had limited options. Refusing would only escalate the confrontation and potentially endanger Timber. "Fine, but I want it on record that we're pursuing proper research authorization." The inspection was thorough and tense. When the officers entered the cabin, Timber initially retreated to Thomas's side but made no aggressive moves. Curtis observed the wolf with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read, something beyond professional interest, something almost personal. "Remarkable specimen," Curtis commented, maintaining a safe distance. "Where exactly did you find him?" "On my property," Thomas replied. "Shot and left to die." "Reported the shooting, did you? To whom? The people who did it, or the department that would euthanize him?" Curtis's expression hardened. "The law exists for a reason, Dr. Harrington. Wild predators aren't pets or science projects. They're dangerous animals that require proper management." "Is that what happened with your daughter?" Thomas asked quietly. "Proper management?" The room went still. Sheriff Reed looked between them with sudden concern. Curtis's face drained of color, then flushed with anger. "You have no right to mention my daughter," he said, voice dangerously low. "I think I do," Thomas pressed. "If you're using her death to justify a vendetta against wolves, including this one." "Thomas," Eleanor warned softly. Curtis stepped closer, professional demeanor cracking. "You know nothing about what happened to Lily." "I know the medical examiner noted impact injuries consistent with a fall, not a predator attack," Thomas replied. "I know the investigation was suspiciously brief, with you as the only witness." For a moment, Thomas thought Curtis might strike him. Instead, the man turned to the officers. "Document everything. This animal is being removed today under wildlife protection statutes." He fixed Thomas with a cold stare. "And add interference with a federal investigation to the charges." Sheriff Reed interceded. "Now hold on, Curtis. Dr. Keller has filed paperwork. There's a process here." "A process being abused to keep a dangerous predator in inappropriate conditions," Curtis snapped. "This wolf shows clear signs of habituation to humans. That alone makes it a public safety risk." During this exchange, Timber had been watching intently. Now, To everyone's surprise, the wolf deliberately walked to Eleanor's research materials and pawed at a specific folder containing the behavioral assessments. The action was so clearly intentional that even the officers paused. Eleanor seized the moment. That's exactly the kind of cognitive behavior we're studying. This wolf demonstrates intelligence far beyond typical parameters. Removing him now would disrupt valuable research. Curtis dismissed the display. Coincidence or simple conditioning, it doesn't change the regulatory requirements. The standoff continued until Sheriff Reed suggested a compromise. Curtis, how about this? The wolf stays here under temporary research dispensation for 2 weeks while Dr. Keller's permit application is expedited. We post a deputy to monitor the situation and ensure public safety. Curtis clearly disliked the suggestion, but recognized the witnesses present would make forced removal problematic. 1 week, he countered. And the animal must be secured at all times with proper containment. Before anyone could respond, the confrontation took an unexpected turn. Timber began making an unusual sound, not quite a growl or whine, but a deliberate vocalization. He moved to a bookshelf and pawed at a specific volume until it fell open, revealing old newspaper clippings Thomas had forgotten were there. The room watched in stunned silence as the wolf nosed through the fallen pages, stopping at a specific article. Thomas knelt to examine it, feeling a chill when he saw the headline, "Tragedy in Coconino Forest. Girl killed in rare wolf attack." The article included a photograph of Curtis with his arm around his daughter Lily at a campsite. In the background, barely noticeable, was a distinctive rock formation. "Eagle Cliffs," Thomas said, recognition dawning. "That's where it happened." Curtis's reaction was immediate and visceral, a flash of panic quickly masked by anger. "This has gone far enough." "The wolf is coming with us now." But Sheriff Reed had noticed Curtis's reaction. "Curtis, what's got you spooked?" "Nothing," Curtis snapped. "I'm simply tired of this circus. We have a warrant and a duty to remove a dangerous animal." Eleanor had moved to examine the photograph. "Eagle Cliffs has a ranger station with archived incident reports," she said. "And if memory serves, they installed wildlife cameras in that area around 15 years ago, right after Lily's death." Thomas watched Curtis carefully. "Camera footage that was never included in the investigation? I wonder why." The implication hung in the air. Sheriff Reed, sensing the shifting dynamics, made a decision. "We're going to pause this operation until we have complete clarity. Curtis, I think we should continue this discussion at the station." "This is federal jurisdiction, Marcus," Curtis said stiffly. "Maybe so, but I've got questions about an incident in my county that suddenly seem relevant." Reed's tone was respectful but firm. "Dr. Harrington, Dr. Keller, that wolf stays secured on these premises until we sort this out. I'll have a deputy check in daily." After they departed, Curtis seething but complying with Reed's directive, Thomas and Eleanor stood in stunned silence. Timber returned to his place by the wood stove as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Did that just happen?" Thomas finally asked. "Did Timber just deliberately show us that article?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. "I can't explain it. The statistical probability of random behavior producing that specific outcome." She didn't finish the thought. Thomas knelt beside Timber, studying those intelligent eyes. "What are you?" he asked softly. "And what do you know about Curtis Blackwell?" The wolf offered no answers, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Timber had just deliberately changed the course of their confrontation, and perhaps much more. That evening, as storm clouds gathered over the canyon, Eleanor made a discovery while reviewing her photographs of Timber's unusual shoulder marking. "Thomas," she called, excitement in her voice. "Look at this." On her laptop screen was an enhanced image of the scarred pattern, now clearly recognizable as a stylized PG within a circle. "I've seen this before," Eleanor said. "It was used by a research project in the early 2000s, the Pure Gray Initiative. They were documenting and preserving genetic samples from what they believed were the last remaining North American gray wolves with unaltered genetic profiles, no dog or coyote DNA. Pure bloodlines, Thomas murmured. Why would that matter? Evolutionary history, for one thing. These wolves represented the original North American populations before human interference. But the project was controversial. Some researchers wanted active breeding programs. Others felt resources should focus on existing populations regardless of genetic mixing. Eleanor looked up at Thomas. The project was disbanded after funding issues, but rumors persisted that some researchers continued independently. "And timber carries their mark," Thomas said, watching the wolf dozing by the fire. "If he's truly a pure gray wolf, he could be immensely valuable from a conservation perspective. These bloodlines were thought to be effectively extinct in the wild." The implications were significant. A confirmed pure gray wolf would receive substantial protection under endangered species provisions, protection that would supersede Curtis's authority. "We need to confirm with DNA testing," Eleanor said. "I've sent samples to a colleague at the university lab, but results will take time." Time, Thomas suspected, was something Curtis Blackwell wouldn't give them willingly. Whatever had happened at Eagle Cliffs 15 years ago, Curtis clearly felt threatened by their questions, and perhaps by Timber himself. As if reading his thoughts, Timber rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the gathering storm. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a fitting underscore to the tension Thomas felt building around them. "Whatever happens," Thomas told Eleanor, resting a hand on Timber's broad back, "I'm not letting them take him." The storm that had threatened all evening finally broke around midnight, bringing torrential rain and violent winds that rattled the cabin's old windows. Thomas lay awake, listening to the tempest while Timber paced restlessly near the door. Something about the wolf's behavior set Thomas on edge, an unusual alertness, a tension in his powerful frame. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked, rising from his bed. Timber whined softly, pawing at the door. Thomas hesitated. Letting a wolf out during a thunderstorm seemed unwise, but Timber's agitation was growing. Finally, Thomas pulled on his rain jacket and boots. "All right, but we're not going far," he warned, opening the door. The rain hit like a physical force, driven sideways by gusting winds. Lightning split the sky, momentarily illuminating the landscape in stark relief. Timber immediately bounded from the porch, stopping at the edge of the property to look back expectantly. Thomas cursed under his breath but followed. His arthritis protested each step, and he could feel his heart working harder than it should. Still, something in Timber's urgency compelled him forward. They moved along the eastern fence line, Timber pausing frequently to ensure Thomas kept pace. The wolf seemed to have a specific destination in mind. After 20 minutes of difficult progress, they reached the edge of a ravine that cut across Thomas's property. Normally a dry wash, but now a churning channel of muddy runoff. Timber stopped, staring intently across the ravine. In the next lightning flash, Thomas saw what had drawn the wolf's attention. On the far side, trees had fallen, taking down a section of fence. Beyond the breach, something moved in the darkness. Cattle, Thomas realized aloud. His neighbor's livestock, disoriented by the storm, had wandered through the downed fence. If they tried to cross the ravine in this condition, they'd likely be swept away. Timber barked, a sound Thomas had rarely heard from him, and dashed along the ravine's edge, clearly searching for a crossing point. Thomas followed more cautiously, the mud becoming treacherous underfoot. "We need to head back," Thomas called over the storm. "Get help!" But Timber had already found what he sought. A fallen pine that created a precarious bridge across the narrowest section of the ravine. Before Thomas could react, the wolf was crossing, balancing with remarkable agility on the slick trunk. "Timber, wait!" Thomas shouted, his voice lost in a thunderclap. The wolf reached the far side and disappeared into the darkness. Thomas cursed again, torn between returning for help and following. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and cell service was non-existent in the storm. By the time help arrived, the cattle, and possibly timber, could be lost. Thomas approached the fallen tree. In his younger days, he would have crossed without hesitation. Now, with stiff joints and questionable balance, the narrow, rain-slicked trunk looked impossibly dangerous. Yet something told him timber needed his help. "This is how old men die," he muttered, but began carefully making his way across. Halfway over the ravine, disaster struck. Thomas's foot slipped on the wet bark and he fell hard, managing to grab the trunk with both arms before sliding off completely. He hung there, legs dangling over the churning water below, the current strong enough to sweep him away if he fell. For several agonizing moments, Thomas struggled to pull himself back up, his arms burning with the effort. Just as his strength began to fail, he heard Timber's bark. The wolf had returned and stood watching from the far bank, agitated but unable to help. "Go!" Thomas shouted. "I'll be fine." It was a lie, and somehow Timber seemed to know it. Instead of leaving, the wolf paced anxiously, barking with increasing urgency. Then, to Thomas's astonishment, Timber plunged into the ravine upstream, fighting the current to reach a rock outcropping just beneath Thomas's position. "No!" Thomas cried, fearing the wolf would be swept away, but Timber's strength was extraordinary. He gained the outcropping and positioned himself directly under Thomas, creating a platform with his broad back. The message was clear: if impossible, drop down. Thomas hesitated. Even if he could land on Timber's back, the impact could injure them both. But his arms were failing, fingers growing numb from the cold and exertion. He had seconds, not minutes, before he fell anyway. With a desperate prayer, Thomas let go, dropping the short distance onto Timber's back. The wolf's legs buckled slightly but held. In one coordinated movement, Timber leapt from the outcropping to the bank, carrying Thomas to safety before collapsing in exhaustion. Thomas lay in the mud, gasping, his heart pounding dangerously in his chest. The familiar tightness gripped him, not a full attack yet, but a warning. He fumbled for his medication before remembering it was back at the cabin. Timber rose shakily and nudged Thomas insistently, clearly wanting him to get up. "Can't," Thomas managed between labored breaths. "Heart." Understanding seemed to dawn in those amber eyes. Timber looked around, then back at Thomas, conflicted. The sound of distressed cattle carried faintly through the storm. "Go," Thomas urged again. "Help them." After a moment's hesitation, Timber made his decision. Instead of leaving Thomas to aid the cattle, he began barking with a pattern and intensity Thomas had never heard before. 3 sharp barks, pause, repeat. On and on, a deliberate signal cutting through the storm's cacophony. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, the tightness in his chest alternately easing and intensifying. Rain continued to pound him, mud seeping into his clothes. Through it all, Timber remained at his side, maintaining that rhythmic barking until his voice grew hoarse. How much time passed, Thomas couldn't say. The pain receded enough that he no longer feared imminent death, but weakness kept him immobile. Eventually he became aware of lights piercing the darkness, voices calling over the storm. "Over here!" someone shouted. "I see something!" Flashlight beams swept the area. Timber stood over Thomas protectively, continuing his barking until the rescuers approached, then backing away just enough to allow them access. Sheriff Reed knelt beside Thomas, rain dripping from his hat. "Jesus, Tom, what happened?" Thomas could barely speak through chattering teeth. "Fence, down, cattle." "We know," Reed replied, gesturing to his deputies to help Thomas up. "Your wolf showed up at the Peterson place, raising hell until they followed him. Led them straight to their stray cattle, then brought them here." Thomas struggled to process this information as the deputies helped him onto a stretcher. Timber. Went for help? Looks that way, Reed confirmed, eyeing the wolf with newfound respect. Peterson said that animal herded 15 head of disoriented cattle away from the ravine, then practically dragged him back here by his sleeve. As they carried Thomas toward the waiting vehicles, Timber followed close behind, ignoring the nervous glances from some deputies. Thomas reached out a shaking hand, and the wolf pressed his muzzle briefly against it, a gesture of reassurance. "That's one hell of an animal," Reed commented. "Never seen anything like it." Thomas managed a weak smile. "Told you. He was special." The next hours passed in a blur of emergency room lights, medical procedures, and concerned voices. Thomas had indeed suffered a minor heart attack, exacerbated by exposure and exertion. By morning he had been stabilized, but the doctors insisted on keeping him for observation. Thomas's first coherent thought was concern for Timber. Reed, who had stayed through the night, assured him the wolf was being looked after. "Eleanor's with him at your place," the sheriff explained, "though I think you should know the storm did some serious damage out there. Part of your roof's gone, and there's flooding in the east end of the cabin." Thomas tried to sit up, alarmed. "I need to get back." Reed gently pushed him back down. "Not happening. Doctor's orders, you're here for at least 2 days. "Curtis will use this opportunity," Thomas insisted. "With me out of the way." "Curtis has bigger problems right now," Reed interrupted. "That storm washed out the access road to Eagle Cliffs, exposed some old ranger station archives that were supposed to have been moved to headquarters years ago." He paused meaningfully. "Including security camera footage from around the time of his daughter's death." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with his medical condition. "You've seen it?" Reed nodded gravely. "Enough to warrant a formal investigation into what really happened that day. Curtis has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome." The news should have brought relief, but Thomas felt only a deepening sense of unease. A cornered man was dangerous, especially one with as much at stake as Curtis Blackwell. "Marcus, I need to get back to my property," Thomas insisted. "If Curtis realizes what's happening." "He's under surveillance," Reed assured him. "And I've got a deputy checking on your place regularly. Right now, you focus on not dying, okay?" Despite Reed's reassurances, Thomas spent the day in anxious anticipation, watching the clock and badgering nurses about his release. By evening, he had convinced the attending physician to discharge him the following morning against medical advice but with a strict regimen of rest and medication. That night, Thomas dreamed of Timber standing on a hilltop, silhouetted against a blood-red sky, howling a warning that no one heeded. He woke just after dawn, disoriented and filled with inexplicable dread. A nurse arrived with discharge papers sooner than expected. "Sheriff Reed arranged for early processing," she explained. "Said it was important to get you home." Thomas felt the knot of dread tighten. Reed wouldn't have rushed his discharge without good reason. Outside the hospital, Reed waited beside his patrol vehicle, expression grim. "We need to move," he said without preamble. "Curtis disappeared last night, disabled his tracking anklet, and took his departmental vehicle." "Timber? Eleanor called an hour ago. Your wolf's been agitated all night, like he senses something." "I've got 2 deputies heading out there now, but with the storm damage, the roads are slow going." They drove in tense silence, Reed pushing his vehicle as fast as he dared on the debris-strewn roads. As they approached Thomas's property, Reed's radio crackled. "Sheriff, we've got a situation at the Harrington place," a deputy reported. "Signs of forced entry, but no one's responding inside. Looks like there might have been some kind of struggle." Reed accelerated. "Any sign of Dr. Keller or the wolf?" "Negative. But, sir, there's blood. Quite a bit of it." Thomas felt the world narrow to a pinpoint of focused dread. "Hurry," he urged, though Reed was already pushing the vehicle to its limits. When they finally reached the cabin, The scene confirmed Thomas's worst fears. The front door had been broken in, furniture overturned in an apparent struggle. A trail of blood led from the living room to the back door, which stood open to the damaged yard beyond. One of the deputies approached, expression somber. "We found Dr. Keller's vehicle, but no sign of her. Tried calling her cell, but it goes straight to voicemail." "And Timber?" Thomas asked, dreading the answer. "No sign of the wolf either, but given the blood and fur by the back door." The deputy left the implication hanging. Thomas moved through the wreckage of his home in a daze, trying to piece together what had happened. On the kitchen table, Eleanor's research materials were scattered, her laptop screen smashed. Most concerning was a shattered vial that had contained Timber's DNA samples. "He's destroying evidence," Thomas realized aloud, "making sure there's no proof of what Timber is." Reed studied the blood trail leading outside. "Question is, where did he take them?" Thomas's gaze fell on a map that had fallen to the floor, one of Eleanor's research documents showing historic wolf territories in the region. A location had been circled in red: Eagle Cliffs. "I know where they are," Thomas said, a cold certainty filling him. "Curtis has gone back to where it all started." Reed immediately began organizing a response team, calling in state police and park rangers to converge on Eagle Cliffs. But Thomas knew the winding access roads, damaged by the storm, would slow their approach significantly. "There's a faster way," he told Reed, pointing to a hiking trail on the map. 4 miles cross-country. I can be there in half the time your vehicles can." "Absolutely not," Reed objected. "You just had a heart attack, for God's sake." "And my friends might be dying," Thomas countered, already gathering supplies. "I know those trails better than anyone. Curtis won't expect someone coming from that direction." Reed recognized the determination in Thomas's eyes. "At least take this," he said, offering his backup weapon. "And for the love of God, don't try to be a hero." "Wait for backup if you can." Thomas nodded, though they both knew he had no intention of standing by if Eleanor or Timber were in immediate danger. The hike was grueling, every step a testament to Thomas's stubborn refusal to yield to physical limitations. The trail climbed steadily, winding through storm-damaged forest toward the distinctive rock formation known as Eagle Cliffs. As he approached, Thomas slowed, moving more cautiously through the underbrush. The clearing below the cliffs came into view. Curtis's vehicle was parked haphazardly near the old ranger station, its door standing open. Beyond it, Thomas could make out 3 figures: Curtis standing rigidly, Eleanor kneeling on the ground, and Timber lying motionless beside her. Thomas crept closer, straining to hear their conversation. "You don't have to do this, Curtis," Eleanor was saying, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "We can still find a way to resolve this that doesn't destroy your life." "My life was destroyed 15 years ago," Curtis replied, his voice hollow. "Everything since has been existing, waiting." "Lily wouldn't want this," Eleanor pressed gently. Curtis's reaction was violent. "Don't you dare speak her name. You have no idea what she would want." Thomas had reached the edge of the clearing using a fallen tree as cover. From this vantage point, he could see what he'd missed before. The rifle in Curtis's hands pointed unwaveringly at Eleanor. Timber lay beside her, a darkening stain on his silver coat suggesting he'd been shot, but was still breathing. "It was an accident, wasn't it?" Eleanor continued, clearly trying to keep Curtis talking. "That day with Lily, the cameras caught it, didn't they?" Curtis seemed to fold in on himself. "We were just hiking. I told her to stay close, but she wanted to see the view from the outcropping. I was checking the map when I heard her scream." His voice broke. "She fell. Just fell, 30 feet onto the rocks below." "It wasn't your fault," Eleanor said softly. "Of course it was my fault," Curtis shouted. "I was responsible for her. I should have been watching more carefully, should have held her hand, should have—" He broke off, breathing heavily. When I reached her, she was still alive, barely, suffering. I ran for help, but I knew she wouldn't survive long enough. "So you created the wolf attack," Eleanor filled in. "To give her death meaning." Curtis nodded almost imperceptibly. There had been wolf sightings in the area. It was believable, and it gave me purpose. Something to fight against. His grip tightened on the rifle. I didn't expect the cameras. They were supposed to be offline for maintenance that weekend. When the storm exposed those archives, Thomas realized with growing horror what was happening. Curtis wasn't just eliminating evidence, he was preparing to stage another wolf attack, this time with real victims. "I'm sorry about your wolf," Curtis told Eleanor, gesturing to Timber's still form. "I didn't want to shoot him, but he was remarkably protective. Wouldn't let me near you without a fight." "He's one of the last pure grays," Eleanor said. "You must have recognized the marking. Is that why you've been so determined to control wolf management? To make sure none of them survive to contradict your story?" Curtis's laugh was bitter. "Pure gray, the great conservation hope. Did you know I was part of that original research project? Before Lily died. The irony is—" He faltered. "The irony is, I loved those animals, truly loved them. But after Lily, I needed something to blame, something to hate, something to destroy." Thomas had heard enough. Curtis was unraveling, and Eleanor's life hung by an increasingly frayed thread. Moving carefully from his cover, Thomas circled to position himself behind Curtis. His plan, such as it was, depended on surprise, but he never got the chance to execute it. As he stepped around a boulder, his boot dislodged a loose stone. The small sound was enough to alert Curtis, who whirled, rifle raised. "Harrington," he said, oddly calm now. "I should have known you'd find us." Thomas raised his hand slowly, Reed's pistol concealed beneath his jacket. "It's over, Curtis. The Rangers have the footage. They know what really happened." "Yes," Curtis agreed, with the serenity of a man who had made his final decision. "It is over. But not quite yet." In the moment that followed, several things happened simultaneously. Curtis began to turn the rifle back toward Eleanor. Thomas reached for the concealed pistol, and Timber, wounded but far from defeated, gathered his remaining strength and launched himself at Curtis in a blur of silver fur. The rifle discharged, the shot going wide as Timber's weight crashed into Curtis, sending both wolf and man tumbling dangerously close to the cliff edge. Thomas sprinted forward, heedless of his own safety, as Curtis and Timber struggled on the precipice. "Curtis, stop!" Thomas shouted, but the man was beyond reason, wrestling desperately with the wounded wolf. In the final moment, as the edge began to crumble beneath them, Timber locked eyes with Thomas, a look of such profound understanding that it stole Thomas's breath. Then, with deliberate purpose, the wolf pushed away from Curtis, using the last of his strength to propel himself back toward solid ground, while Curtis, thrown off balance, felt the earth give way beneath him. Curtis's scream echoed briefly, then silence. Thomas rushed to the cliff edge, but there was no sign of the man on the rocks below, only the churning waters of a storm-swollen creek that would carry his body miles before releasing it. Behind him, Eleanor was already kneeling beside Timber, applying pressure to his wound. "He's alive, but barely," she reported, her voice shaking. "The bullets lodged near his shoulder. We need to get him help immediately." Thomas shed his jacket, carefully wrapping it around the injured wolf. As he lifted Timber into his arms, he felt the animal's weight against his chest, still substantial, but lighter than it should have been. Those amber eyes flickered open briefly, meeting Thomas's gaze with the same unfathomable intelligence that had drawn them together from the beginning. "Hold on," Thomas whispered fiercely. "Just hold on." In the distance, sirens announced the approach of Reed and his team. But Thomas knew it wasn't the human authorities that would determine Timber's fate now. It was the wolf's own indomitable will to survive. And perhaps, Thomas allowed himself to hope, the connection that had grown between them against all odds. As he carried Timber down the trail to meet the approaching rescuers, Thomas felt his own heart laboring beneath the strain. But for once, he welcomed the pain, a reminder that he was still alive, still fighting, still capable of carrying this burden that had become the most important in his life. "We're almost there," he promised, though whether to Timber or himself, he couldn't say. Almost there. The veterinary clinic in Flagstaff was small but well-equipped, specializing in large animals and occasionally treating wildlife under special permits. Dr. Marlene Vickers, a former student of Thomas's from his teaching days, had responded immediately to Eleanor's urgent call. "I can't make any promises," she warned as her team wheeled Timber into surgery. "Bullet wounds in wolves are tricky. Their anatomy is similar to dogs, but with important differences." Thomas nodded numbly, too exhausted to speak. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation at Eagle Cliffs had long since faded, leaving him hollow and dangerously weak. Even seated in the clinic's waiting room, he could feel the room tilting occasionally, his damaged heart protesting the day's exertions. Eleanor sat beside him, her own hands bandaged where Curtis had bound them too tightly. "You need to be in a hospital," she said quietly. "Not until I know," Thomas replied, gesturing toward the surgical suite where Timber had disappeared. Sheriff Reed arrived an hour later, his uniform still bearing the dirt and debris from the search. He sank heavily into a chair across from Thomas and Eleanor. "We found Curtis's body 2 miles downstream," he reported without preamble, "and we've recovered the security footage from the ranger station archives. It confirms everything: Lily's fall, Curtis's decision to create the wolf attack narrative." He rubbed his face wearily. 15 years of wolf management policy in this region, influenced by a lie. Thomas absorbed this information with a detached sadness. Curtis's deception had caused incalculable damage to wolf populations and conservation efforts, yet he couldn't summon hatred for the man, only pity for the father whose grief had twisted into something destructive. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. "There'll be investigations, reports, probably policy reviews," Reed replied. Curtis had allies in the department who genuinely believed his story. Some of them won't take this revelation well. Thomas understood the implication. Curtis might be gone, but the anti-wolf sentiment he had cultivated would persist. His legacy of fear wouldn't die with him. The surgery lasted 5 grueling hours. When Dr. Vickers finally emerged, her surgical scrubs spattered with blood, Thomas struggled to his feet, heart pounding with dread. "He's alive," she announced, and Thomas felt his knees weaken with relief. "But I won't sugarcoat this. It was touch and go. The bullet fragmented near his shoulder blade, causing significant internal bleeding. We've removed all the fragments we could find and repaired the damage, but the next 48 hours are critical." "Can I see him?" Thomas asked. Dr. Vickers hesitated. "He's heavily sedated and will be for at least a day." "But yes, briefly." She led Thomas to a recovery area where Timber lay on a padded table, an IV line running into his foreleg, monitors tracking his vital signs. The wolf's powerful body seemed diminished somehow, vulnerable in unconsciousness. Thick bandages encased his shoulder and chest, spots of blood already seeping through despite their recent application. Thomas approached slowly, placing a gentle hand on Timber's head. The wolf's fur felt cool beneath his fingers, the usual vibrant energy absent. "You saved us," Thomas whispered. "Now it's your turn to fight." A commotion in the reception area drew their attention. Dr. Vickers stepped out briefly, then returned with a troubled expression. "There's a group outside," she reported. "Word has spread about the wolf. Some are journalists, but others—" She glanced uncomfortably at Thomas. "Some are locals concerned about having a dangerous predator in town. They're demanding the wolf be transferred to a wildlife facility or—" She didn't finish the sentence. Thomas felt a surge of protective anger. "He just saved 2 lives. He's a hero, not a threat." "I know that," Dr. Vickers assured him, "and we have every legal right to treat him here, but public sentiment is a powerful force. Curtis's narrative has shaped how people think about wolves for 15 years. As if the universe were determined to compound the crisis, Thomas's phone rang, a local reporter seeking comment on the wolf incident at Eagle Cliffs. More calls followed in rapid succession. The story was breaking, details emerging piecemeal and often inaccurately. Some reports characterized Timber as a trained attack wolf that had killed Curtis Blackwell, while others claimed he was an escaped research subject with unusual abilities. Eleanor handled most of the calls, her scientific credentials lending weight to her careful corrections, but the damage was spreading. By evening, social media had erupted with the story, speculation running rampant. A small but vocal group had gathered outside the clinic, some holding signs demanding Timber's removal. "This is insane," Thomas muttered, watching through the blinds as the crowd grew. "He's fighting for his life because he saved ours." Dr. Vickers appeared at his side. "The police are sending officers to maintain order, but I'm concerned about Timber's recovery environment. Stress can be deadly for an injured animal." "We need to move him," Eleanor concluded, joining them at the window. "Somewhere quiet, away from this circus." Thomas knew she was right, but the logistics seemed insurmountable. Timber was in no condition to be transported, and even if he were, where could they take him? That would be both medically appropriate and secure from interference. The answer came from an unexpected source. Sheriff Reed returned that evening with a proposal. "My brother owns a ranch about 40 miles outside town," he explained. "Very private, good security, and he's got a guest house with enough room to set up the necessary medical equipment. Marlene could oversee Timber's care there, away from prying eyes." The offer was a lifeline. By midnight, with the clinic surrounded by media vans and protesters, Timber was carefully loaded into a specially equipped transport vehicle. Thomas insisted on riding with him despite his own precarious health, monitoring every labored breath during the journey. The ranch proved ideal, remote, peaceful, with the guest house situated in a sheltered valley out of sight from the main road. Reed's brother, a taciturn man who asked few questions, helped them establish a makeshift recovery room. Dr. Vickers arranged for a veterinary technician to remain on site, with herself visiting twice daily. For 3 days, Timber hovered between life and death. Infection set in despite antibiotics, his temperature spiking dangerously. Thomas barely left his side, sleeping on a cot beside the wolf's bed, often waking to check that the massive chest still rose and fell with breath. On the 4th morning, Thomas opened his eyes to find Timber watching him, those amber eyes clear and alert for the first time since the shooting. Relief crashed through him with such force that for a moment he couldn't speak. "Hey, big guy," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome back." Timber's tail moved weakly, just a slight motion, but unmistakably deliberate. Thomas called for the vet tech, who confirmed what he hardly dared believe. The fever had broken. Timber was turning the corner. Recovery, however, was only one battle. Outside their peaceful sanctuary, the controversy continued to rage. The revelation of Curtis's 15-year deception had thrown regional wildlife management into chaos. Environmental groups demanded a complete review of wolf culling policies, while ranching interests fought to maintain the status quo. More troubling were the persistent rumors about Timber himself. Despite Eleanor's scientific explanations, stories of a super-intelligent wolf had captured public imagination. Wildlife authorities were under pressure to take custody of Timber for proper assessment, while research institutions clamored for access. Thomas knew that even with his health improving, Timber remained vulnerable. A wolf that had killed a human, regardless of the circumstances, faced a precarious future in the human world. "They'll never leave him alone," Thomas told Eleanor one evening as they reviewed the latest batch of interview requests and official inquiries. "Every researcher, every bureaucrat, every sensation-seeking journalist will want a piece of him." Eleanor nodded grimly. The pure gray confirmation hasn't helped. "Now he's not just a curiosity, he's a scientific treasure. The DNA results are conclusive. Timber represents a genetic line thought extinct in the wild." This scientific validation should have been a victory. Instead, it felt like another threat to Timber's freedom. The rarer and more special he proved to be, the more hands would reach for him. The breaking point came a week later. Thomas returned from a brief supply run to find Eleanor in heated conversation with two officials from the Federal Wildlife Service. Their unmarked vehicle was parked obtrusively in front of the guest house. "This is a courtesy notification," one was saying as Thomas approached. "The transfer order has already been approved. We'll be moving the specimen to the research facility tomorrow morning." "He's not a specimen," Thomas interjected, anger burning through his fatigue. "And he's still recovering from life-threatening injuries." The officials turned to him with the practiced patience of bureaucrats accustomed to emotional civilians. "Mr. Harrington, we understand your attachment to the animal. However, as an endangered species of significant scientific value, this wolf falls under federal jurisdiction. The facility is well equipped to continue his medical care." "And then what?" Thomas demanded. "Lifetime captivity? Endless tests? Being treated like a laboratory curiosity rather than a living being?" "That's not for us to determine," the second official replied smoothly. "Our mandate is simply to ensure proper custody of protected wildlife. The transport team will arrive at 8 a.m. After they departed, Thomas stood in stunned silence, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. Everything he and Eleanor had fought for, Timber's recovery, the revelation of Curtis's deception, the validation of the wolf's unique heritage, had led not to protection, but to a different kind of cage. "They can't just take him," Thomas said, though he knew perfectly well they could and would. Eleanor's expression reflected his own despair. "Legally, they're within their rights. Timber is officially classified as an endangered wild animal. Private individuals aren't permitted to keep such animals without specific permits, which we don't have." Thomas looked through the window to where Timber lay resting on a padded bed, still weak but improving daily. The wolf's ears perked up as he noticed Thomas's attention, his eyes holding that same penetrating intelligence that had first formed their connection. In that moment, Thomas made a decision that he knew might cost him what remained of his professional reputation, his freedom, perhaps even his relationship with Eleanor. But watching Timber, who had risked everything to save them, he couldn't see any other choice. "I need you to leave," he told Eleanor quietly. "Now. And when those officials return tomorrow, you need to be genuinely surprised and upset about what's happened." Eleanor studied his face. "Thomas, what are you planning?" "It's better if you don't know. But I need your word that you'll deny any knowledge or involvement." For a long moment, Eleanor was silent, internal conflict evident in her expression. Finally, she nodded. "Be careful," she whispered, gathering her things. "Both of you." After she left, Thomas moved methodically, gathering only essential supplies, medical items for Timber's continued treatment, food, water, the basics for survival. He loaded these into his old truck, which Reed's brother had retrieved from his property days earlier. Night fell, bringing a silver crescent moon that cast just enough light to work by without attracting attention. Thomas entered the guest house one last time, approaching Timber's bed. "Time to go, partner," he said softly. Timber rose unsteadily, still weak but determined. Thomas helped him into the truck's back seat, which he'd prepared with blankets and cushions. Then, without headlights, he drove slowly away from the ranch, taking a little-used fire road that would eventually connect with the national forest. As the lights of civilization receded behind them, Thomas felt a weight simultaneously lift from and settle onto his shoulders. He was now officially a fugitive, harboring an endangered species, evading federal authorities, abandoning the remnants of his former life. Yet alongside this burden came a profound sense of rightness. For the first time in 15 years, he was acting with absolute moral clarity. Beside him on the seat lay a map marked with their destination, a remote area deep in the national forest where Thomas had conducted research decades earlier. There, a small cabin built for scientific observations had likely been forgotten by the Forestry Service after funding cuts. If it still stood, it would provide shelter while Timber completed his recovery. After that, Thomas didn't allow himself to think that far ahead. As dawn broke over the eastern mountains, Thomas glanced back at Timber. The wolf was awake, gazing out the window at the passing wilderness, his expression almost contemplative. Despite everything, the pain, the danger, the uncertain future, there was a dignity in his bearing that transcended his injuries. "We'll make it," Thomas promised, though the road ahead was longer and more perilous than either of them could imagine. 6 months of isolation changed a man. Thomas discovered this truth as winter yielded reluctantly to spring in the remote wilderness that had become their sanctuary. The abandoned research cabin had indeed still stood, dilapidated but structurally sound, hidden in a valley so obscure it didn't appear on recreational maps. They had arrived as fugitives. They had become ghosts. Thomas's beard, now fully gray and untrimmed, covered much of his face. His clothes, patched and worn, hung loosely on a frame that had grown leaner through months of physical labor and limited supplies. At 65, he had expected his health to deteriorate under these conditions. Instead, the daily routine of survival had strengthened him. His heart, once his greatest vulnerability, had stabilized with consistent exercise and absence of stress. Even his arthritis troubled him less, though he attributed this more to necessity than miracle. Timber's transformation had been equally remarkable. The bullet wounds had healed completely, leaving only puckered scars beneath his thick coat. His strength had returned twofold, his frame filling out until he stood as the magnificent specimen nature had intended. During their daily excursions, Thomas often found himself breathless watching Timber navigate the wilderness, a silver shadow moving with fluid grace through terrain that challenged even experienced hikers. Their routine had evolved organically. Mornings began with a shared meal, Thomas preparing his own simple fare while portioning appropriate food for Timber. Though the wolf could hunt, Thomas maintained his diet with supplemental nutrition to ensure his continued recovery. Afterward, they would patrol their territory, Thomas checking his rudimentary security measures while Timber ranged ahead, alert for any human encroachment. They had needed these precautions. 3 times during their exile, search teams had ventured close to their hidden valley. Each time, Timber had provided early warning, allowing Thomas to obscure their tracks and temporarily relocate deeper into the wilderness until the danger passed. Communication between man and wolf had evolved beyond anything Thomas could have imagined. Timber recognized dozens of spoken words and responded to complex instructions with uncanny comprehension. More impressive was his ability to communicate his own intentions through a sophisticated combination of vocalizations, body language, and deliberate actions. Thomas found himself engaged in what could only be described as conversations, limited by their different species, certainly, but conversations nonetheless. April brought the first warm days, sunlight lingering longer on the mountainsides. Thomas sat on the cabin's small porch consulting the calendar he had maintained meticulously through their isolation. By his calculation, today marked exactly 6 months since they had fled the ranch. 6 months as a fugitive from a system he had once respected. Timber emerged from the tree line, trotting purposefully toward the cabin. In his jaws he carried a small branch, not unusual as he often collected firewood, but his demeanor suggested something different. Reaching Thomas, he dropped the branch deliberately at his feet. Thomas examined it with confusion, then understanding. The branch wasn't random. It was applewood, bearing the season's first blossoms. There were no apple trees in their immediate vicinity. Timber must have traveled considerable distance to find it. "Spring gift?" Thomas asked with a small smile. Timber's response was to turn his attention eastward, staring intently down the valley with pricked ears. His posture communicated alertness rather than alarm. Thomas followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. "What is it, boy?" The wolf began walking in that direction, then stopped, looking back expectantly. The invitation was clear. "Follow me." Curious, Thomas gathered his walking stick and small pack of essentials. Timber led him along game trails he had never explored, moving with purpose through increasingly unfamiliar territory. After nearly 2 hours, they crested a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the valley system beyond their hidden sanctuary. In the distance, Thomas could make out a road, the first sign of human infrastructure he had seen in months. But Timber's attention was fixed on something else. A small herd of animals moving through a meadow far below. Thomas raised his binoculars. "Wolves," he breathed in astonishment. Indeed, a pack of perhaps 7 gray wolves moved through the tall grass, hunting what appeared to be elk. Their coordinated movements spoke of experienced hunters working in perfect harmony. Thomas lowered the binoculars to find Timber watching him intently, as if gauging his reaction. "Is this what you wanted to show me?" "Your kind?" Timber's gaze returned to the distant pack, a low whine escaping his throat, the first Thomas had heard from him in months. The sound carried such longing that Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. The realization struck with painful clarity. Timber was meant to be with his own kind. Despite their extraordinary bond, Thomas had been fooling himself believing the wolf could be fulfilled by human companionship alone. Timber was a social animal evolved for pack life, not solitary existence with an aging human. They watched the distant wolves until dusk began to fall, neither moving to leave though the temperature dropped. Finally, Thomas placed a hand on Timber's broad back. "You missed them," he said softly. "Your own kind." Timber turned to him, those amber eyes reflecting the fading light. In their depths, Thomas read a complexity of emotion that transcended simple animal instinct. There was yearning there, but also attachment, loyalty, conflict. The journey back to their cabin was made in silence, both lost in private thoughts. That night, Thomas lay awake, confronting a truth he had been avoiding. Their current situation was unsustainable. Winter had provided natural isolation, but with spring bringing increased human activity to the wilderness, discovery became more likely with each passing day. More importantly, he had to consider what was best for Timber. Morning brought unexpected clarity, and the sound of a helicopter. Thomas bolted upright, momentarily disoriented until the thrum of rotors registered fully. Timber was already at the window, body tense but not panicked. Moving quickly to the door, Thomas scanned the sky. The helicopter was still distant, following the main valley rather than approaching their hidden location. Its markings identified it as Forest Service rather than law enforcement, likely conducting routine spring surveys rather than searching specifically for them. Nevertheless, the intrusion shattered their isolation, reminding Thomas forcefully of the world beyond their sanctuary. He watched until the helicopter disappeared over a distant ridge, then turned to find Timber observing him with that uncanny perception. "Time's running out for us here," Thomas acknowledged aloud. Later that day, as if the universe were determined to reinforce this realization, Thomas discovered fresh boot prints along the stream where they collected water. Someone, a hiker or hunter, had passed within half a mile of their cabin without either of them noticing. The wilderness was awakening from winter, and with it came human presence. That evening, Thomas made the most difficult decision of his exile. They would need to leave, not just the cabin, but this life they had built together. Timber deserved the chance to integrate with his own kind, to fulfill his nature as a wild wolf. And Thomas needed to stop running. The plan formed with surprising clarity. Using the emergency radio he had kept charged but unused, Thomas would contact Eleanor. She had been their only indirect connection to civilization, leaving occasional supplies at predetermined drop points without ever meeting them directly, respecting Thomas's need for complete deniability on her part. Before making the call, Thomas spent a final day with Timber, hiking to a high ridge that offered views across the mountains they had called home. The wolf seemed to sense the significance of the moment, staying closer than usual, occasionally pressing against Thomas's leg in a gesture that had become their familiar expression of connection. "I need to tell you something," Thomas said as they watched the sun begin its descent. "And I need you to understand, though I don't know if you can." Timber sat beside him, attentive as always when Thomas spoke directly to him. "Tomorrow people will come. People who want to help you. They'll take you to a place where you can be with other wolves." Thomas's voice grew rough. "It's what you need, what you deserve. A real life, not hiding in the shadows with an old man." The wolf's steady gaze never wavered. "I'll have to go away," Thomas continued, the words physically painful to speak. "There are consequences for what I've done. But you'll be protected, your bloodline preserved. The truth about Curtis will ensure that." Timber shifted closer until his warm bulk pressed firmly against Thomas's side. Whether the wolf truly comprehended the impending separation, Thomas couldn't know. But the gesture provided comfort nonetheless. That night, Thomas finally used the emergency radio, connecting with Eleanor on their prearranged frequency. Her voice, crackling through the small speaker, carried equal measures of relief and concern. "Thank God," she said when she recognized his voice. "Are you both all right?" "We're fine," Thomas assured her. "But it's time to end this. I'm ready to turn myself in." There was a pause before Eleanor responded. "Things have changed, Thomas. You need to know what's happened while you've been gone." What followed was a revelation that left Thomas stunned. The story of Curtis Blackwell's deception, Timber's heroism, and Thomas's disappearance with the wounded wolf had captured national attention. Environmental groups had rallied around their cause, using the narrative to challenge decades of wolf management policies based on fear rather than science. More surprisingly, public opinion had shifted dramatically in their favor. The image of a man risking everything to save a wolf that had in turn saved human lives resonated deeply. Find Timber had trended on social media for weeks, evolving from a search effort to a movement advocating for wolf conservation. "The federal charges against you were dropped 3 months ago," Eleanor explained. "There was too much public pressure. Instead, they've been working with conservation groups to establish a protected status for Timber and any pure gray wolves that might be discovered." Thomas struggled to absorb this information. What about the research facility? They wanted to take him for study. That's been replaced with a proposal for a wolf sanctuary. On your land, Thomas. Your property has been held in trust, and there's funding to expand it into a research and education center with you as the director if you want it. The possibility was so far from what Thomas had expected that he could barely comprehend it. They want me to run a wolf sanctuary? After I stole a federally protected animal and disappeared for 6 months? Eleanor's laugh crackled through the radio. They're calling you a conservation hero now. Amazing what a little media attention can do. Her tone grew more serious. But Thomas, there's something else you should know. We've confirmed a small pack of wolves approximately 20 miles east of your location. DNA testing from scat samples suggests they may be related to Timber's bloodline, not pure but close. Thomas glanced at Timber, who lay near the cabin door, apparently sleeping but with one ear swiveled toward the radio. We saw them today. Timber led me to a ridge where we could observe them. He found them? Eleanor's excitement was palpable even through the poor connection. Thomas, this is incredible. If Timber could integrate with that pack, it could reintroduce those pure gray genetics into the wild population. The conversation continued long into the night, laying out a plan that seemed more fantasy than possibility to Thomas's isolated mindset. Yet with each detail Eleanor provided, the vision of a future neither fugitive nor conventional took clearer shape. 2 days later, as arranged, Thomas and Timber hiked to a predetermined meeting point, a small clearing accessible by a rarely used fire road. Thomas had expected Forest Service vehicles, perhaps even media. What he found instead was Eleanor alone, waiting beside her battered Subaru. Their reunion was emotional but brief. Eleanor had brought documentation for Thomas to review: the legal dismissal of charges, the sanctuary proposal, letters of support from conservation organizations and academic institutions. It was, as she had described, a complete reversal of his situation 6 months earlier. "Where are the others?" Thomas asked, still expecting officials to appear. "I convinced them to give us space for the initial contact," Eleanor explained. "There'll be time for formal meetings later. Today is about bringing you both home safely." Thomas absorbed this, then looked to Timber, who had remained at the edge of the clearing, watching their interaction with alert interest. "And him? What happens to him now?" Eleanor followed his gaze. "That depends partly on him. The sanctuary would provide protected territory where he could live safely. But if he chooses to integrate with the wild pack we've identified..." She shrugged. "That would be ideal from a conservation perspective, but ultimately, it's about what's best for him as an individual animal." The three began the journey back to civilization, a strange procession of one wolf and 2 humans walking a forgotten fire road. As they approached the main forest access point, Thomas spotted a small gathering waiting for them. Sheriff Reed, Dr. Vickers, and a few others he recognized as supporters from the community. There were no cameras, no officials with clipboards, just people who had come to welcome them home. Thomas felt a tightness in his throat at this unexpected reception. As they reached the small group, Reed stepped forward, extending his hand. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Tom." "Doctor." Vickers moved immediately to examine Timber, her professional demeanor barely containing her excitement at seeing her former patient thriving. "The recovery is remarkable," she observed. "Better than I could have hoped." The gathering maintained a respectful distance from Timber, who observed the proceedings with characteristic intelligence, but stayed close to Thomas's side. There was no fear in his posture, but a watchfulness that suggested he understood this moment marked another significant transition. As they prepared to leave the forest that had been their sanctuary, Thomas knelt beside Timber, looking directly into those amber eyes that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. "Whatever happens next," he said softly, "whether you stay with me or find your own path, I want you to know something. He placed a gentle hand on the wolf's broad head. "You saved more than my life. You saved who I am." Timber held his gaze with that profound understanding that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Then, with deliberate gentleness, he pressed his forehead against Thomas's chest. A gesture so tender, so unlike the ferocious predator the world believed wolves to be, that Thomas felt tears threaten for the first time since their journey began. The small group watching maintained a respectful silence, witnessing a connection that defied conventional understanding, yet spoke to something universally recognized: the profound bond that can form between living beings, regardless of species. As they finally turned toward the waiting vehicles that would carry them back to civilization, Thomas felt neither victory nor defeat, only the quiet certainty that whatever the future held, something extraordinary had been revealed through their shared journey. Something about wolves, certainly, but perhaps more importantly, something about what it meant to be human. 1 year later, Thomas Harrington stood on the observation deck overlooking what had once been simply his property, and was now the North Arizona Wolf Conservation Center. The spring sun warmed his face as he surveyed the transformation: new fencing enclosing nearly 200 acres, a modern research building where his humble cabin had stood, educational facilities welcoming visitors from across the country. Most importantly, protected within this sanctuary lived 4 wolves with confirmed pure gray genetics, their presence a living rebuke to Curtis Blackwell's 15-year campaign of misinformation. "Penny for your thoughts," Eleanor said, joining him at the railing. Their professional partnership had deepened over the months of creating the sanctuary, evolving into something neither had anticipated but both now cherished. "Just marveling at how quickly things change," Thomas replied. "A year ago I was a fugitive living in the wilderness. Now I'm running a wolf sanctuary with federal funding." Eleanor smiled, the lines around her eyes crinkling. "Life's full of plot twists, speaking of which Dr. Reynolds wants your input on the latest genetic analysis. The results from the Miller Creek Pack are promising." The Miller Creek Pack, the same wolves Thomas and Timber had observed from the ridge during their exile, had become the focus of their most ambitious project. DNA samples confirmed that several members carried partial pure gray genetics, suggesting historical interbreeding with Timber's ancestors. The sanctuary team had been monitoring them closely, documenting their range and behaviors without direct intervention. "I'll review them this afternoon," Thomas promised. "Any word from the tracking team?" Eleanor's expression softened with understanding. She knew who he was really asking about. "No change since yesterday. Still holding the same territory, approximately 12 miles northeast of here." Thomas nodded, trying to mask his disappointment. It had been 3 months since Timber had made his choice, slipping away one winter night to seek out the wild pack they had observed together. The GPS collar he wore, a compromise Thomas had reluctantly accepted, allowed them to monitor his movements from a distance, confirming he had successfully integrated with the Miller Creek wolves. It was the right outcome, the best outcome from both conservation and ethical perspectives. Thomas knew this intellectually. Timber was fulfilling his natural role, contributing his pure genetics to strengthen the wild population. Yet the absence left a void that the sanctuary's success couldn't quite fill. "He's where he belongs," Eleanor said gently, reading his thoughts as she often did. "I know," Thomas agreed. "I just miss him." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a school bus in the parking area below. Today's educational program would bring 5th graders from a Phoenix elementary school, part of the sanctuary's mission to reshape public perception of wolves through direct education. "That's my cue," Thomas said, straightening his sanctuary logo shirt. Despite his initial reluctance, he had discovered a genuine talent for communicating with visitors, particularly children. His first-hand experience with timber provided stories that captivated audiences, humanizing wolves while respecting their wild nature. The morning program went smoothly, the children's enthusiasm energizing despite Thomas's lingering melancholy. He led them through the educational center, explaining wolf ecology, pack dynamics, and conservation challenges. When they reached the observation area overlooking the sanctuary wolves' territory, the children pressed eagerly against the glass. "Will we see actual wolves?" a small girl asked, peering intently into the naturalistic habitat beyond. "They're wild animals who choose when to appear," Thomas explained. "Sometimes they're visible, sometimes not. That's part of respecting them, understanding we can't control when they come and go." As if on cue, a slender female wolf emerged from the tree line, moving gracefully across an open meadow. The children gasped collectively, their excitement palpable. Thomas identified her as Nova, a 2-year-old female rescued from an illegal private collection, her partial, pure gray heritage evident in her distinctive coat pattern. "She's beautiful," the same girl whispered, awestruck. "Yes, she is," Thomas agreed, "and important. Each of these wolves carries genetic material that nearly disappeared forever. By protecting them, we're preserving something irreplaceable." After the school group departed, Thomas retreated to his office, a modest space in the new research building with large windows overlooking the sanctuary grounds. The walls displayed framed photographs documenting the center's development, alongside scientific papers their work had already generated. Most prominently displayed was an image of timber, captured during their time in exile. The wolf standing proudly on a sunlit ridge, embodying wild dignity. Thomas was reviewing Dr. Reynolds' genetic analysis when Sheriff Reed appeared in his doorway, an unusual visitor during working hours. "Got a minute, Tom?" Reed asked, his expression unreadable. "Of course." Thomas gestured to a chair. "Everything all right?" Reed settled his aging frame into the seat with a sigh. "Depends on your definition of all right. Just got word from Fish and Wildlife. They've confirmed poaching activity on the north boundary of the National Forest. 2 wolf carcasses found yesterday." Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "The Miller Creek pack?" "Can't confirm yet, but the location—" Reed hesitated. "It's within their known territory." The implication hung heavily between them. Somewhere in that same territory, Timber roamed with his adopted pack. "Thought you should hear it from me," Reed continued. "Fish and Wildlife has a team investigating. They've promised to keep us updated." After Reed departed, Thomas found himself unable to focus on work. The specter of poaching, the same crime that had first brought Timber into his life, now threatened to take him away permanently. Despite all their efforts to change public perception, despite the sanctuary's success, old hatreds persisted. Eleanor found him still at his desk hours later, the genetic reports untouched before him. "You heard about the poaching?" she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded grimly. 2 confirmed kills. No word on identities yet. "The federal investigation team arrived an hour ago," Eleanor informed him. "They've requested our tracking data on the Miller Creek pack to narrow their search area." "And Timber's last known location?" Eleanor hesitated. According to the GPS data, he was within 3 miles of where the carcasses were found. "But Thomas, that was yesterday morning. The signal's been stationary since then." "Stationary?" Thomas felt his heart rate accelerate. "The collar's not moving at all?" "It could be malfunctioning," Eleanor suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. "Or it could have been removed somehow." Thomas was already rising, gathering his jacket. "Or he's been shot and is lying somewhere injured." "Or worse." "Thomas, wait." Eleanor placed a restraining hand on his arm. "The federal team is already searching. They have dogs, equipment, trained personnel." "They don't know him like I do," Thomas interrupted. "They won't recognize his patterns. his preferences. He checked his watch. There's still 4 hours of daylight. I can reach the last transmission point before dark. Eleanor recognized the determination in his expression, the same that had led him to flee with Timber a year earlier. I'm coming with you, she said firmly. And we're taking proper equipment and backup. This isn't a solo mission. The compromise was quickly arranged. Eleanor would accompany Thomas along with Dr. Reynolds and a sanctuary security officer. They would check in regularly with both the sanctuary and the federal search team. Their goal was information gathering only, no interference with the official investigation. The drive to the national forest boundary passed in tense silence. Thomas mentally reviewed the topographical maps he had studied during their exile, the ridgelines, water sources, and sheltered valleys Timber had favored. If the wolf was injured, he would seek familiar ground, someplace defensible yet accessible to water. At the forest access point, they transferred to ATVs for the final approach to the GPS coordinates. Spring had transformed the landscape since Thomas's last visit, the understory thick with new growth, wildflowers dotting clearings between towering pines. Under different circumstances, he would have appreciated the renewal. Now he scanned constantly for any sign of disturbance. Broken branches, blood trails, the evidence of violence. They reached the GPS location shortly before sunset, a small clearing beside a seasonal stream, now flowing strongly with snowmelt. Thomas immediately noted the absence of wolf sign, no tracks, no scat, no evidence Timber had passed this way recently, despite the collar data suggesting otherwise. Spread out, he instructed the others. Look for anything unusual, human footprints, shell casings, disturbed ground. The search revealed nothing until Dr. Reynolds called from the stream's edge. Thomas! Over here! Following her voice, Thomas found her kneeling beside a partially submerged object, Timber's GPS collar, intact but removed, the signal still transmitting despite water damage. Deliberately placed here, Dr. Reynolds observed, carefully retrieving the device. The clasp isn't broken, it's been properly opened. And look, wedged under this rock so it wouldn't wash away. Thomas examined the collar with growing confusion. The release mechanism required specific manipulation that would be nearly impossible for a wolf to perform alone. Yet there were no signs of human interference, no footprints, no scent of strangers that would have lingered in the damp soil. It doesn't make sense, he said, frustration evident in his voice. The collar was designed to stay on unless removed by humans. Eleanor joined them, examining the site with scientific detachment. There's something else odd. Look at this pattern in the mud. She pointed to a series of marks along the stream bank. Not quite footprints, but deliberate impressions forming a recognizable pattern. Thomas stared, recognition slowly dawning. It's an arrow, he said finally, pointing northeast. The security officer looked skeptical. You think a wolf left you directions? Thomas ignored the incredulity in his tone. Northeast follows the stream up toward the ridge. There's a sheltered valley on the other side, good hunting territory, protected from the prevailing winds. He turned to Eleanor. That's where he'd go. That's where he'd take the pack if there was danger. The sun had nearly set, casting long shadows through the trees. Protocol and safety demanded they return to the vehicles before darkness made navigation hazardous. Yet Thomas felt a certainty that transcended rational caution. You three head back, he decided. I'm going to follow this lead while there's still light. Predictably, Eleanor objected. Absolutely not. It's getting dark, we have minimal equipment, and there are armed poachers in the area. I know this terrain, Thomas insisted. I lived in these woods for 6 months. The valley is less than 2 miles from here. I can reach it and be back before full dark. The argument might have continued indefinitely had a sound not interrupted them, a distant wolf howl echoing across the forest. Everyone froze, listening intently. The howl came again, longer this time, followed by a chorus of responding calls. That's the pack, Dr. Reynolds confirmed unnecessarily. Multiple animals communicating over distance. Thomas was already moving, following the stream uphill toward the sound. That's them. And they're exactly where I predicted, the valley beyond the ridge. Logic suggested returning for proper equipment and reinforcements. But logic had little hold against the pull Thomas felt, a certainty that had guided him since the day he'd first found Timber wounded in the thicket. Eleanor must have recognized this, for instead of further objection, she simply retrieved emergency supplies from her pack. "We go together," she stated firmly, "and we maintain radio contact with base, non-negotiable." The climb to the ridge was arduous, made more challenging by the fading light. Thomas set a pace that pushed his 65-year-old body to its limits, ignoring the protests of joints and muscles. Eleanor matched him step for step, her scientific curiosity evidently overcoming her procedural caution. They reached the ridgeline just as the last direct sunlight disappeared, painting the western sky in spectacular oranges and purples. Below them spread the valley Thomas had described, a natural bowl sheltered by surrounding highlands, bisected by the stream they had been following. From this vantage point they could see the entire expanse bathed in the soft glow of dusk. At first, the valley appeared empty. Then movement caught Thomas's eye, a flash of silver gray emerging from the trees at the far end. His breath caught as recognition dawned instantly, even at this distance. "Timber," he whispered. The wolf moved with purpose across an open meadow, his distinctive size and coloration unmistakable even in the dim light. Behind him followed 6 other wolves. The Miller Creek pack Thomas had observed from afar, but never seen this clearly. They moved as a coordinated unit, evidently on an evening hunt. Eleanor raised her binoculars, adjusting quickly for the low light. "It's definitely him," she confirmed. "And he's uninjured from what I can see." Thomas accepted the binoculars, focusing on the wolf that had changed his life. Timber looked magnificent, his coat thick and healthy, his movements powerful and confident. Most notably, he traveled at the head of the formation, the others following his lead. "He's the alpha," Thomas realized aloud. "He's leading them." For several minutes they observed in silence as the pack moved through the valley below, unaware of the human observers on the ridge. The wolves' behavior was textbook pack hunting, spreading out to cover more ground, communicating through subtle body language, working as a single organism despite their physical separation. "Perfect cooperative predation," Eleanor murmured, "and look how the others defer to him. He must have established dominance shortly after joining them." The scientific observation, accurate though it was, somehow diminished the moment for Thomas. What he was witnessing transcended biological categorization. It was Timber, his Timber, fulfilling his true nature, becoming what he was always meant to be. The pack disappeared into the trees on the opposite side of the valley, continuing their hunt. Thomas lowered the binoculars, emotions conflicting within him. Relief that Timber was alive and thriving warred with a renewed sense of loss. The wolf clearly no longer needed him, had perhaps never truly needed him as Thomas had needed Timber. "We should go," Eleanor said gently. "It'll be fully dark soon." Thomas nodded, taking one last look at the valley where Timber now lived. "He's where he belongs," he acknowledged, echoing Eleanor's words from earlier that day. Only now, he truly believed them. They had begun their descent when another sound reached them, a single wolf howl, distinct from the pack chorus they had heard earlier. This call was deeper, more sustained, and directed toward the ridge where they stood. Thomas stopped, turning back. In the gathering darkness he could just make out a solitary figure at the edge of the meadow below. A wolf, separated from the hunting pack, looking directly up at their position on the ridge. Even without binoculars, Thomas knew. "It's him!" As they watched, Timber lifted his head and howled again, a long, complex vocalization that seemed to hang in the twilight air. There was no mistaking the deliberate nature of the call or its intended audience. "He knows we're here," Eleanor said, wonder evident in her voice. "Somehow, he knows it's you." Thomas felt something shift within him, a resolution of the conflict he'd carried since Timber's departure. The wolf wasn't lost to him. He had simply found his rightful place. Their connection transcended physical proximity. Raising his hands to his mouth, Thomas responded the only way he could, with a human approximation of a wolf howl, sending his voice across the darkening valley. The sound was poor compared to Timber's magnificent call, yet it carried his recognition, his acknowledgement. For a moment the silver wolf remained still, as if committing the moment to memory. Then, with a final glance toward the humans on the ridge, he turned and loped gracefully after his pack, disappearing into the forest that was now his home. As Thomas and Eleanor made their careful way back down the ridge, a peaceful certainty settled over him. Timber was safe, fulfilling his purpose as nature intended. The poachers who threatened the pack would be caught, the sanctuary would continue its work, and the pure gray bloodline would survive through Timber's descendants. Most importantly, Thomas understood now that some connections didn't require physical presence to endure. What he and Timber had shared, what they still shared despite the distance between them, had changed them both irrevocably. The dying wolf he had rescued had, in turn, rescued him from a half-life of bitterness and isolation. By the time they reached the vehicles, stars crowded the night sky above the forest. The search team had gathered, concerned by their extended absence. As Thomas reported their findings, the removed collar, the healthy pack, Timber's evident leadership role, he felt a weight lifting that he hadn't realized he still carried. Later that night, returning to the sanctuary under a canopy of stars, Thomas found himself smiling. For the first time since Timber's departure, he felt not loss, but gratitude. He had been part of something extraordinary, a bridge between worlds, a witness to wildness. "You're at peace with it," Eleanor observed from the driver's seat beside him. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Thomas agreed, watching the moonlit landscape pass outside his window. He showed me what I needed to see. The North Arizona Wolf Conservation Center continued its work through changing seasons. Under Thomas's direction, it became a model for conservation efforts nationwide, its research advancing understanding of wolf genetics and behavior. Visitors came from across the country to learn about the maligned predators, often leaving with transformed perspectives. Thomas himself became something of a reluctant celebrity in conservation circles. His story, from disgraced veterinarian to fugitive to sanctuary director, captured public imagination, putting a human face on abstract environmental issues. He accepted this role not for personal validation, but for the opportunity it provided to advocate for the creatures he had come to understand so deeply. The Miller Creek Pack thrived under Timber's leadership, their territory expanding as their numbers grew. Each new generation carried the pure gray genetics that had nearly been lost, a living monument to the failure of Curtis Blackwell's campaign of misinformation. On the anniversary of their return from exile, Thomas hiked alone to a ridge overlooking the sanctuary. The valley below buzzed with activity. Researchers collecting data, visitors exploring educational exhibits, sanctuary wolves moving through their protected territory. Beyond this managed space stretched the wilderness where Timber now lived, wild and free as nature intended. Thomas settled on a sun-warmed rock, content to observe the world he had helped create. At 66, he felt more purpose and peace than he had known in decades. His body still bore the scars of his journey, both physical and emotional, but they no longer defined him. From the forest beyond the sanctuary boundary came a familiar sound, a wolf's howl, deep and resonant, carrying across the distance. Thomas smiled, recognizing the voice even after months of separation. Some might call it coincidence, this wolf call on this particular day. Thomas knew better. "I hear you, old friend," he said softly to the empty air. "I hear you." Thomas Harrington's journey reminds us that life's greatest chapters can begin when we least expect them. At 65, isolated and haunted by past failures, he found redemption not through human forgiveness, but through the unlikely bond with a wounded wolf who saw worth in him when he'd forgotten his own value. Like Thomas, many of us face seasons where our purpose seems lost. Careers end, loved ones depart, health challenges arise. Yet his story whispers a powerful truth. It's never too late to matter again. The wolf sanctuary Thomas built wasn't just about conservation, it was about reclaiming significance in life's third act. When timber chose freedom, Thomas learned perhaps the most beautiful lesson of aging, that loving sometimes means letting go, and that our legacy lives on in those we've touched, even when paths diverge. Each of us carries the capacity for meaningful connection and purpose, regardless of age or circumstance. What unexpected encounter has changed the direction of your life when you thought your most significant chapters were behind you? Or like Thomas watching timber lead his pack from the ridge, what have you nurtured that now thrives beyond your direct care, filling you with quiet pride? Share your story in the comments below.